Well, good morning again. It's a real pleasure to be here with you today, for the first time, for a few minutes, to reflect together and to tell you a bit of my own story, since we are still just getting to know one another. I grew up in a Unitarian Universalist church in Arlington, Virginia. So being in this space has elements that feel instantly familiar. The chalice, the hymns, the people, something about the feel of being here. I've been singing May Nothing Evil Cross This Door since I was 6. So this is a little bit like coming home. Since that time of my life, I've heard stories of people who find their way to Unitarian Universalist communities from other places. My own late mother's story, which I'll say more about in a minute, is one of those stories. And my story is maybe one of those stories too, except that the place I left was my UU church. And the place I found my way to was the Episcopal Church, where I now worship and work. That makes it strange for me to be here. On the one hand, I'm not a UU anymore, but on the other hand, there is something about this place that feels like coming home. As they say, some of my best friends are UUs. On one hand, I have a lot at stake in communities like this one being the best communities they can be. But on the other hand, there's maybe not a lot I can tell you about how to do that. What I can offer you this morning, I think, is a little bit of testimony, a little bit of my own story and reflection. And for that, we have to go a ways back. Because my UU story starts with my mother. Mom grew up in northeast Oklahoma in a little town called Ramona. She and her family attended the local Baptist church. There are some great Baptist churches, some faithful and free ones, but this place, at least as my mother experienced it, was about social control. There was no drinking or dancing, certainly no sex. When she was graduated from high school at 18, she spent the next year lacing boots in a factory that had a contract with the Air Force in Tulsa. She went to secretarial school at night, and then she came east, where she worked her way up the secretarial pool in D.C. until she ended up working in the White House and traveling the world. Dancing, drinking, probably sex. And there's one experience in particular that I want to be sure to mention, because my mother, who had never been outside the country, ended up meeting David on a flight to Paris. David was the first openly gay person she had ever met, and he became her closest friend. This was in 1970 or so, just toward the beginning of the modern movement for gay rights, and Mom and David were inseparable friends until he died of AIDS in 1991. She hadn't been to church since she was a teenager. But when my sister and I were born, she wanted us to grow up with something. So she toured church after church and ended up in the local Unitarian Universalist church. For my mother, it was important to her that she could choose what to believe, that she could make her own judgments about God. And she wanted those things for her children. I grew up in a household where choosing that sort of thing was my sovereign right. The thing that was great about our UU church was the thing that was great about America, the freedom to choose. Now, I don't know if that story sounds familiar. I suspect for at least some of you it does. My mother wasn't the only person to end up in a UU church because she felt stifled or constrained by the tradition she was raised in. That's how my mother told us her story, from oppression into freedom. What's unsaid, at least sometimes, is that not everybody has the same freedom to choose. A few summers ago, my family, all of us US citizens, went on a trip to Mexico. And when we got back, we chose to walk across the border right at the checkpoint into the United States. Our US passports gave us that choice. But is that choice available to everyone? When I drive home to see my family in DC, what choices do I have about how fast to drive or about what to say to a cop when I get pulled over? And are those same choices everyone's to exercise? In my job, in my church, I can meet privately with my boss. I can avoid harassment and abuse, and what I say will be believed. But is that true for everybody? As has become ever more clear, it's not. So, for 20-year-old UU me, it was an act of Unitarian Universalist piety, an act of making my search for truth and meaning more responsible, to notice what I could choose and what other people couldn't. And I found as a person decisively shaped by the white supremacy, the male supremacy, the straight supremacy of this society, that nothing I did could claim innocence. We don't have the hours it would take to tell the full story of my going from UU to Christian, but it starts there, with a growing awareness as a young adult of what I now call sin, of violence, racism, economic and sexual exploitation, and the ways that it pervades everything, even me. Now, thinking through those things doesn't solve every big problem, but in a tradition that prizes our ability to choose, it was worth investigating why some people get choices that other people don't. Now, the point isn't that my path is one that anyone else should follow. The point certainly isn't that anyone else should go and become a Christian or be an Episcopalian. We've got our own problems, God knows. And some of you probably know it too. The point is that if we're serious about the responsible search for truth and meaning, if we're serious about the worth and dignity of every person, if we're serious about our interconnectedness, and those are things my UU church taught me that I carry with me wherever I go. If we're serious about those things, then we have to be prepared to risk some things we cherish. If we share a vision of a world in which Black lives matter, everyone has the resources they need. If we share a vision of a world free from violence, harassment, and abuse, and where the richness of every gender and every sexuality may express itself as it will, if we share a vision of those things, then even getting into the conversations we need may mean giving up something very UU, the right to absolute self-determination. To even say that feels funny. It feels like some sort of betrayal of my mother, who left rural Oklahoma to determine her own course, and who worked her job and volunteered at her church until she died, so that her children could also choose. That story of going from constraint to freedom is a story we tell ourselves over and over again about what has always made America great. And it's the same story I think we hear and tell about what has made Unitarian Universalism great. And I wonder if that similarity between what makes America great and what makes UUism great should give us just a moment of pause. I remember a seminary classmate of mine, a black woman, saying to me, "Your freedom isn't for me." Not, "I'm not free." Not, "That freedom sounds good and I'd like some." But there is something wrong with your idea of freedom. What she meant was that my freedom to enter conversations on my terms can be at the expense of other people's ability to have conversations on their terms. And one thing I take away from what she said to me is that we have to ask who our idea of freedom is for. Freedom meant freedom to have slaves before it meant freedom for slaves. Your idea of freedom, my friend was saying, is about freedom of action, but not about who you're responsible to. About what you choose to do, but not about who those choices affect. And that was convicting for me. As a person who thought that freedom of choice in every part of life was not only my right as a human being, but some sort of ultimate good. And as my friend's words have turned over and over in my mind, what I have begun to wonder is this. For those who share some version of that story, of escaping authority and finding our way to a place like this one, have we lost some accountability along the way? In the end, what makes our idea of freedom and the choices we can make different from the one peddled as making America great again? So we can and we should denounce an idea of American greatness that wants to return us to a time in which women and people of color had fewer choices and neighborhoods and jobs were off limits to black people. We can and we should deplore deportations and mass incarceration. But what exactly makes the walls we build to guard our own autonomy different from the walls of prisons or the ones under construction at the southern border? So maybe the question now is not just whose authority can we get away from, but who else can we make ourselves responsible to? I don't want to pretend this is easy. There are times when being accountable to other people, listening to them, operating on the basis of being in this together with them, can seem like an overwhelming and bitter burden. An infringement on our ability to, damn it, decide for ourselves. Everything in our politics, in our culture, even what we hear from the people we sometimes call friends, tell us that a person's freedom and joy is found in escaping one another. That making ourselves great or great again relies on drawing somebody out of the circle. If I buy myself the house with the high fence, if I keep the wrong people out of my country, if there is a business or a book or a Fifth Avenue tower with my name on it, then I can finally be happy and free. If I can build a concrete wall against my Mexican neighbor, or a theological wall against heretics, or a church wall, this one right here, against people too different, then salvation can finally be mine. The truth is, there are lots of people we're not accountable to. Whether it's other people in our congregations, those whose land our churches are built on, or those whose labor, paid and unpaid, makes our lives and livelihoods possible. Even my mother's story, as we heard it growing up, is a version of that story. But there were parts of her life, of church growing up, of the place where she came from, the people around her that she needed to escape from. If I can have a church where no one is telling me what to do, then I can finally be saved from hell. And hell really is other people. But I think looking back, my mother's classic UU story of escaping the authoritarianism of her Baptist church growing up and finding the freedom of her UU church, I think there is another way to tell that story. Because the choice of a Unitarian Universalist congregation was only partially about escaping authority. I think it was also an act of accountability, of choosing to be in a place that would see her best friend David as a full person. That any community that wouldn't see that wasn't worth her investment of time and money and faith. She made his life, not just her own, a central criterion for who she would be and how she would make her way in the world. His life, and not just her own. Now for me, speaking for myself, an important part of my journey into Christian life has been recognizing more and more the ways in which choosing to let other people's lives choose for me is part of how I and the people I love get saved. But it's the values I learned in my UU church growing up that made me take that interconnectedness seriously. The seventh principle of Unitarian Universalism drove me there. And even though taking it seriously for me involved a deep dive into Christian life, I don't think anybody needs to be a Christian to take it seriously. As a parent, I'm deeply connected with my children, Simon and Oscar. No matter how they behave in church, I am deeply connected to them. And by accepting that connection, that responsibility, I've committed myself to limiting my own choices. I can't just move to a different city or take just any job or do whatever I want on a Saturday night, because the ways that that affects my children are really clear. But the UU seventh principle, the interconnectedness of all things, pushes me to extend the boundaries of those vows. This isn't just an abstract affirmation that we all need one another. It takes particular shapes in particular times and places. It looks different here in Kingston than it does where I live in the Bronx. But for me, one of the things it means is that my work for peace with justice has to happen in a way where my desire to be the hero or the savior is constrained. Following other people's lead and wisdom. Not just out of respect for them, but because there are parts of my freedom I can't get to without them. As a person who grew up being told I could choose anything I wanted, part of my journey into a different faith community has been to honor the interconnectedness my UU church also taught me. And honoring that interconnectedness sometimes takes the form of giving up my right to choose. Giving up what I want to do in favor of what we do together. Living in a place of uncertainty and even anxiety when other people tell me something about their lives, or ask something from me that is outside my experience, or seems to cut too close. And for what it's worth, I think this is also the politics we need. In a moment where each of us being on our own is what fascism wants from us. This is why mass shootings and union busting and defunding of public schools are all part of the same agenda. Because if we cannot depend on one another, if we cannot make sure there is some sphere in which we are bold enough and rested enough and know enough to make decisions together, then the only ones we can depend on are bosses and cops. And I mean literal bosses and cops, but I also mean metaphorical bosses and cops. People to tell you what to do and people to back it up with violence if you don't. So if we can find ways to be accountable to more people rather than fewer, I think we can make a trial and a necessity into a joy. I really do think this is good news. The ways in which I'm accountable to my partner or my children, the ways in which my mother was accountable to David, those aren't things that we experience as burdens, but as divinely given sources of delight. The ways in which we are accountable to our neighbors who are immigrants, our neighbors who are poor, our neighbors who are felons, who are Christian or Muslim, even maybe, if we try hard enough, fellow members of this congregation who have different priorities, different hopes, who are just annoying, maybe those can be great joys too. And to learn how to treat them as great joys, we can look to our relationships with friends and partners and children that are already sources of both accountability and joy. My accountability to those I love the most is not a grim act of duty, but a deep, free, and life-giving pleasure. The kind where the circle of friends drawn together by both of us is richer than either of our circles by itself, where my young children are more alive for all the difference and disagreement among their parents and godparents, where worship is richer, freer, holier, because it isn't all just for me. When it's not about who we escape from, but who we let come with us, and who we let take us with them. When deciding together is more free, not less, than simply getting my way. And that is good news we can share together, in spite of it all.